You're driving down a quiet road just before sunrise. The trees are dark, the grass is wet, and for half a second, something moves between the headlights. A deer standing perfectly still, watching you. It looks almost like the forest has produced an animal whose only job is to eat plants, reproduce, and occasionally run across highways. But what if the deer disappeared tomorrow? What if every forest woke up without a single deer? And what if, instead of becoming healthier, those forests began changing in ways we couldn't immediately see? Because the strange thing about deer is that they can look completely unnecessary while quietly influencing entire ecosystems. For centuries, humans have measured animals by what they give us: meat, milk, labor, protection, companionship. But nature doesn't use our accounting system, does it? Walk into a forest where deer live, and you may notice almost nothing. A few hoof prints in the mud, some leaves missing from a young tree, a pile of pellets beneath a bush. Nothing dramatic. But hidden inside those tiny traces is a question that ecologists have been asking for decades. What happens when an animal that seems ordinary becomes a force powerful enough to reshape an entire forest? In the 1940s and 1950s, researchers began using one deceptively simple experiment. They built fences around pieces of forest, small areas where deer could not enter. Outside the fence, deer browsed normally. Inside, plants grew without them. Then, researchers waited, and the forest began telling two different stories. Young trees that struggled outside sometimes survived inside. Shrubs changed, wildflowers changed, the composition of the forest floor changed. But here's where it gets strange. The result wasn't simply that deer were good or bad. In some places, too many deer reduced plant diversity and prevented young trees from reaching adulthood, while in other situations their browsing created openings that benefited particular plants and animals. So the question became much harder. If deer can damage a forest when there are too many of them, could the same animal still be important when there are fewer? And that question leads somewhere unexpected. Imagine a deer walking through a forest at night. It eats leaves, it moves several hundred meters, then several kilometers, and eventually it leaves behind something most people would never think twice about: a pile of dung. In 2004, researchers Jonathan Myers, Mark Velland, and Sana Gardescu studied white-tailed deer in eastern North America and found something remarkable. More than 70 plant species germinated from deer feces collected over a year. The deer had eaten plants in one location, carried their seeds inside their bodies, traveled across the landscape, and deposited those seeds somewhere else. Some seeds traveled farther than they could realistically have moved on their own. The deer was not simply eating the forest, it was moving pieces of the forest, and suddenly that seemingly useless animal looked less like a consumer and more like a transportation system built from muscle, bone, and four legs. But if deer can move plants around, what happens when they begin changing which plants survive? A young forest might contain dozens of plant species. A deer walks through and repeatedly chooses the most nutritious leaves. Those plants are eaten more heavily. Others are ignored. Over years, the forest can slowly shift. In Pennsylvania, a 7-year study involving Penn State researchers, the Pennsylvania Game Commission, and the State Department of Conservation and Natural Resources examined deer browsing alongside soil nutrients and competing vegetation to understand why some trees regenerate while others fail. The answer was complicated. Sometimes deer mattered enormously. Sometimes soil mattered more. Sometimes competing plants mattered. And sometimes the interaction between them mattered more than any single factor. That is the uncomfortable lesson. Nature rarely gives us one villain or one hero. Instead, everything seems connected to something else. And nowhere is that more obvious than when we introduce another animal into the story: a wolf. For decades, Yellowstone National Park had no wolves. They had been eliminated from the region by the mid-20th century. Without wolves, elk populations and their behavior changed. And because elk eat vegetation, the disappearance of a predator could eventually influence trees and shrubs hundreds of meters away. When wolves were reintroduced in 1995 and 1996, scientists suddenly had something resembling a natural experiment. A predator returned, prey responded, plants experienced different levels of pressure, and researchers began studying what became known as a trophic cascade, the possibility that changing one level of a food web can send effects all the way down to vegetation. The story became famous because it seemed almost magical. Wolves affect elk. Elk affect plants. Plants affect rivers, soil, insects, birds, and everything else connected to them. But here's where everything changes. Scientists later discovered that the Yellowstone story was more complicated than the popular version. Some research found evidence supporting wolf-driven changes in vegetation. Other studies found that the recovery of aspen and other plants could not simply be explained by wolves frightening elk away. A 2010 study by Matthew Kaufman and colleagues, for example, found that aspen recruitment patterns did not show the simple dramatic recovery predicted by the popular popular wolf cascade story. So even one of ecology's most famous examples refuses to fit neatly into a story of heroes and villains. And deer live inside that same complexity, because deer are not just prey. They are browsers, seed dispersers, competitors, food for predators, hosts for parasites, and moving animals that physically connect different pieces of habitat. In other words, removing them wouldn't simply remove one animal. It would remove a moving part from a machine whose full design we may not even understand. There is another strange connection. For years, people often linked deer abundance to Lyme disease because adult ticks commonly feed on deer. That sounds simple. More deer, more ticks, more disease? Except researchers studying Lyme disease discovered something much more complicated. A 2012 analysis by Richard Ostfeld and colleagues argued that Lyme disease risk could be strongly influenced by small mammals and predator communities, rather than simply tracking deer abundance. In some landscapes, changes in foxes and other predators could alter populations of small mammals that infect ticks, so the chain could look something like this: predator, small mammal, tick, disease, human. And somewhere in that chain stands a deer, not as the single cause, not as the single solution, but as one piece of a network that becomes increasingly difficult to separate. Now imagine removing that piece. The forest doesn't collapse dramatically. There is no explosion, no alarm. The sun rises tomorrow. Birds still sing, trees still stand. But perhaps certain seeds stop traveling as far. Perhaps some plants become more abundant while others disappear. Perhaps predators lose prey. Perhaps different animals begin competing for different resources. And perhaps the forest slowly becomes a different forest. That word, slowly, is important, because ecological change often hides from human attention. A human life is short. A forest operates on decades and centuries. A tree may spend years as a tiny seedling before becoming part of the canopy. So imagine looking at the same forest once every 10 years. Would you notice the invisible consequences of removing one species? Or would you simply think the forest had always looked that way? This is why scientists sometimes call deer a keystone species. Not because every deer is holding the ecosystem together like a superhero, but because the influence of deer can be disproportionately large compared with the simple act of eating leaves. And there is an even deeper twist. If deer can be important, that does not mean more deer are better. In fact, excessive deer populations can suppress forest regeneration and reduce biodiversity in some ecosystems. Researchers have documented forests where heavy browsing prevents young trees from replacing older ones. A forest can look perfectly green from above while quietly losing its next generation underneath, and that creates a paradox. The animal is necessary. The animal can also become destructive. The difference is not always the animal. Sometimes it is the balance around the animal: predators, plants, weather, human land use, disease, habitat, competition. Every part changes every other part. And suddenly the original question begins to sound almost childish. Why aren't deer useless? Because perhaps useful was never the right question. A deer doesn't need to build a shelter for another species. It doesn't need to produce something humans can sell. It doesn't need to consciously improve the forest. It simply has to exist inside the network. It eats, it walks, it reproduces, it dies. And through those ordinary actions, energy and matter move from one organism to another. A leaf becomes a deer becomes a wolf, a seed becomes a tree becomes shelter becomes insects become birds, and eventually every part of the system becomes food, habitat, nutrient, movement, or opportunity for something else. So perhaps the most surprising thing about deer is not that they are useful. It is that nature may not contain very many truly useless things at all. A creature can appear insignificant when viewed alone, but place it inside a forest and suddenly its footprints connect to seeds. Its appetite connects to trees. Its body connects to predators. Its movements connect distant habitats. And its absence might become visible only after years have passed, which leaves us with a strange thought. Maybe an ecosystem is not a collection of useful animals. Maybe it is a web where usefulness emerges from relationships we barely notice. And perhaps that is why the deer standing motionless in your headlights feels so different now. You thought you were looking at an animal doing almost nothing, but behind those eyes is a creature connected to plants, predators, parasites, soil, seeds, forests, and even disease. Not the master of the ecosystem, not its victim, not its purpose, just one moving thread in something much larger. And if removing one ordinary animal can quietly change an entire forest, how many other invisible connections are surrounding us right now? Connections we mistake for nothing simply because we haven't learned how to see them yet?